It's great to be down here in London, especially with the weather. As a native Californian, I'm enjoying it. As someone who's lived in Scotland for 3 years, I'm slightly confused why I'm actually sweating, but it is enjoyable. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about what it means to think theologically and politically about the narratives that are currently shaping us in the United Kingdom specifically, but I think importantly, and something that I can bring as someone who is himself an immigrant, not an expat, an immigrant, and who's worked for the last 2 years on the World Communion of Reformed Churches Task Force on Migration in Europe, is a transnational perspective on what's happening in the UK. Because what's happening in the UK and the challenges that we all are facing are not wholly distinct from the questions and narratives occurring on the border between Mexico and the United States, on the borders between Greece and Macedonia, on Lampedusa or in Libya, or even in places like the Emirates, Kenya, or Lebanon. So I think it's important for us to think a little bit about that. But also, I am a theologian, a Christian Protestant theologian, so I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So I hope you'll bear with me, and it'll be somewhat clear. Why do so many Christians find the nationalist narratives around immigration more compelling than the gospel? Why is it that a lifetime of preaching, of tasting God's reconciling love, which casts out fear, has so little impact on the political perspective of so many of our members? These questions were asked by a Swiss Protestant pastor at a gathering of the World Communion of Reformed Churches European Task Force in Budapest in April of this year, only 5 days after Orbán had been re-elected, himself a member of the Reformed Church who was hosting us, who was also blessed by the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Budapest, who himself had defied Pope Francis's call to welcome refugees in every parish. The concerns expressed by the Swiss pastor, however, were echoed by other ministers, lay Christians, Muslims as well, who were gathered there together. In each context, from Britain to the Balkans, from Greece to Germany, the narratives of the state, of political debates, of news stories, provided a more comprehensive, compelling, and persuasive framework for thinking about community, justice, and belonging than scripture, tradition, or theology. I think that's actually true. That is not to say that the gospel has had no impact, provided no salt, no light to political narratives. I've been able to see over the last 2 years a small Greek church tell of how the parable of the Good Samaritan provided the initial impetus to visit those makeshift camps that were developing on the Greek-Macedonian border in 2015 and 16, and how the encounters with Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis fleeing had transformed their whole town and community from one marked by what Susanna Snyder calls an ecology of fear to an ecology of faith. Churches, mosques, and synagogues in Germany recalled how they came together to welcome the influx of people in Bavaria and Bonn into their communities, turning mosques and churches and synagogues into makeshift welcoming centers. And the Waldensians and Catholics of Sicily joined together in patrols on the Mediterranean Sea, holding joint funeral services for those that are lost, defying the most recent rulings from Italy. The Church of Scotland, of which I'm a representative, although not a member, created and funded an ecumenical and interfaith group, Scottish Faith in Action, to think and act with recent refugees who have been resettled from Syria, breaking down borders not only between Scots and Syrians, but also, ironically, between Syrians and Syrians and Scots and Scots. Still, even with these counterexamples, the questions of that Swiss pastor and the fact that they resonated so widely with so many people still haunt me. And when I was asked to talk about narratives, this is the narrative I wanted to talk about. Why is it that those narratives, the political and news narratives, seem to be more persuasive and more powerful than the Christian gospel for those of us who are Christians, or the inherent dignity and humanity of every individual as marked in the Human Rights Declaration, or of the discourses of other religious traditions of welcoming neighbors and strangers and bearing witness to justice. And if I'm right that these are more powerful, and I think that I am, but you can challenge me later, at least for most people, how might we nurture new narratives that displace the power of these political narratives? I'm not going to accomplish that in the next 22 minutes, but I'm going to try to sketch something out. To begin this work, we need to first come to grips with some of the key plot points in the dominative narratives around immigration and how they come to define and silence human beings seeking political asylum, or those even who have recently been resettled, even sometimes for those of us who wish to advocate for them. Following this very brief outline, the paper will consider why and how the dominative political narratives around immigration function to provide a more powerful framing, and why our appeals often to operate within that fall short. Finally, I'll close by asking how practices of solidarity, encounter, and disruption might, grounded in the dignity of all human beings apart from the law. This is something I think is important. The dignity of all human beings apart from the law. That's a little Protestantism for you. Might challenge and relocate these political narratives. Simply put, the paper argues that a fundamental rewriting of our story is needed. One that shifts the central character from the politics of the state and the nation, who has taken power unto themselves, making themselves God in the framing of Carl Schmitt, to the dignity of the human being, both in, beneath, and beyond the law. So that's what I'm gonna not accomplish, but this is what I hope to sketch out. The longer paper will try to accomplish it and fail to. So what are some of the political narratives that are not only shaping the United Kingdom, which we've heard quite clearly about, but also the broader political context that we find ourselves in? One of the things that I've found fascinating in my work over the last 3 years is the resonance between the rhetoric, policies, and perspectives found here in the United Kingdom or in the United States with those not only throughout Europe, but also throughout the Middle East, which is where I work. I can't speak to Southeast Asia or to Sub-Saharan Africa, but I'll speak to places that I've been working in Lebanon and Jordan and in the Emirates. And what's fascinating and what has been pointed out is that there's something not only of a return of populist nationalism, right, which we've often heard about and seen, but also a transnational populism. That many of these groups and organizations are in solidarity and consideration with one another. One easy example I can give you, when I left the Budapest airport in April and drove into the city, all throughout the city were signs plastered everywhere. These were not political campaigns for Orban and his party. They were official government information. And they had a massive picture of Syrians fleeing through Germany with a large stop sign. There were hundreds of these on bus stops and billboards. On closer inspection, you realize that it was the very same image that Farage had stood in front of, right? So these images and these narratives are shared across models. Now, this isn't only the case in far-right groups, but also some of the fears about culture and belonging and the ways in which statistics seem to be insufficient are vital. So what are some of the dominant narratives, just really briefly, that form this ideology? I think it operates in a few ways. First, as we've already talked about, and I won't get into at great length, is the issue of economic burden and contribution. There remains a dominant narrative, as Sarah pointed out, of scarcity. That there is simply not enough jobs, not enough food, not enough money in the NHS system or in the healthcare systems of these countries to allow for immigrants in general and refugees and asylum seekers more specifically to belong. I should probably turn off that sound, right? This is a dominant narrative, and one of the tendencies and one of the things I'm going to try to get us to resist is to continue to respond to these narratives on their own terms, right? So there's the dominant of economic burden and contribution. We know, in fact, that when it comes to broader immigration numbers, although not always with refugees and asylum seekers, that these numbers simply do not stand up. Tariq Madood, for instance, has recently written a report in 2014, sponsored by the British Academy, that showed that most often, the stats aren't sure, immigrants provide more than they take, right? So there's this issue of economic burden. The other is of safety and security, which is the dominant narrative of my own president, who has tweeted out just yesterday that crime rates in Germany are up over 10% and the highest they've been in 40 years. The notions of safety and security of migrants coming to our shores is a dominant narrative that reaches from the Emirates, right? These are similar things you hear in Lebanon, in the Emirates, in Jordan, as well as in the United Kingdom. Of course, we also know that these statistics don't pan out nearly as well. Immigrants in general, asylum seekers, and undocumented immigrants in the case of the United States often commit crimes at a far lower rate than the general population. And as the German government responded to Trump's tweet, in fact, the German crime rates are at their lowest in 30 years. You also have the issue, and this is, I think, a unique one to the United Kingdom, of the fixation on statistics and numbers, right? Of a quota that one aims to get at, to get below. And the entire policy seems to be driven around this false promise. One of the reasons that I introduced myself by saying I am an immigrant is that when I say this in the United Kingdom, people say I'm not. Well, part of that is how these statistics function. When you say there are 235,000 immigrants into the United Kingdom, I know that's not the right number, I'm just making one up, last year, what comes to mind in most people's mind, partly because of some stuff I'm going to get to hopefully later in the paper about the way in which the state binds and looses and defines, is not someone like myself or Mohammed Salah, both of us immigrants, right? Football player on Liverpool who tragically lost last night. All of my Egyptian friends I was watching with it are in tears, right? But the numbers that are given, which also include students who make our universities feasible, right, are read politically as all being people who are dependent. So you have this interesting function in the UK in which all immigrants are read as asylum seekers, which undermines a whole host of issues that need to be addressed. And I know today we're focusing on refugees and asylum seekers more specifically, and I appreciate the focus on the single issue and the necessity for that. But I think one way that we can focus on the single issue is to disrupt this fixation on statistics and the ways in which they're used to reinforce this more important notion, which is the integrity of the nation. And I think it's not just the integrity of the nation, but the integrity of the race. What is really at stake in many of these debates is what does it mean to be British? Or more specifically, now maybe this is a Scottish jab, what does it mean to be English? What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be American? Why is it that I am read as not an immigrant but as an expat, but my colleague Mona Siddiqui, who I'm often with, who has British citizenship, raised here, educated here, appears on the BBC, wrote a report for the Home Office, is asked when we're together where you're from. It is impossible to locate that as anything other than race. And that the fact that I have whiter skin and speak English as a native language, even though she does as well, means that I am read outside of this as somehow non-threatening to the integration into Britishness. Does that make sense? Yeah. And in fact, I will confess, I don't integrate. I mean, I try to, but maybe this is just Scots, I can't speak to the whole of the UK. It's extremely difficult to break in to British societies and cultures, especially if you come from a society and a culture that is more gregarious, right? So if I, as a native speaker, don't fit in, if the majority of my friends in Edinburgh over the last 3 years happens to be Americans, Lebanese, Egyptians, other expats, how much more difficult is that, right? So this notion of integration as if it's only on the migrant and doesn't involve something within the society is something I think we need to address. But at the core of this narrative, I think, of this narrative of scarcity, of numbers, and of fear, and of safety and security is the question of the nation. Two examples, one more academic and one more popular, have presented philosophical and political arguments for these more restrictive and limited policies of immigration and, by extension, asylum recently in the United Kingdom. I reference them not because they are the best works on the subject, but because they've both gotten a fairly large reading, but they also put their finger on what I do think is the deeper core and why we need a new narrative that doesn't operate within a fixation on statistics, law, and rights, essentially operating as a liberal version of the existing nationalist narrative. More specifically, interestingly, however, for our purposes, I think actually their turn to something outside of economy and law is the right one. I just think they turn in the wrong way. And I think what we need to be thinking about together as we co-produce what an alternative might be is how other models of this turn could be possible. And I think that's what I'll suggest. Douglas Murray's, I'm sorry I have to do it, The Strange Death of Europe, has received wide-ranging reviews and coverage from across the political spectrum, even receiving a special endorsement from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks as one of the most vital works of 2017. Like any good opinion piece writer, Murray's arguments are bold, broad, polemical, and provocative, opening with the audacious claim that Europe is, quote, committing suicide. Throughout the book, Murray unfolds the reasons for this. A cultural malaise that fails to embrace the rich heritages of the continent, a fissure of the Christian roots and values that made Europe, and by Europe in general and Britain more specifically, a country and a nation. A far too wide embrace of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism that fails to take moral and political difference seriously. But of course, the chief culprit in Europe's suicide is immigration. And we might add especially Muslim immigration, as the subtitle, Immigration, Identity, and Islam indicates. Murray's concern is not only, however, with the events of 2014 and 15, but the longer story of post-war European immigration, especially in France, Germany, and especially the United Kingdom. In a series of crisp, statistically rich, although not always accurate, one-sided chapters, Murray contends that multiculturalism has failed, that migrants have failed to integrate, that the social welfare system is under immense strain, and that European leaders continually look away from the religious and cultural differences that influence this. My point in bringing up Murray's book is not to commend it, far from it. I simply want to point out that this is an example of a powerful and persuasive narrative that captures the imagination of a wide swath of the general public. And part of that is he touches on the issue of cultural identity, what Brubacher calls a Christian civilizationism, which means not simply that one is a Christian, actually that doesn't matter so much, it's this vague notion of Christian or British values that he's able to touch on, and couples that with issues of economic problems and security. The anxieties that he touches upon, and the way that he distanced himself from far-right groups like the EDF and Pegida, even as he gives an air of seriousness to many of their concerns, I think has proven central to the rise of anti-immigrant political parties, not only here in the United Kingdom, but across Europe. In fact, the continued attention given to the EDF and Pegida in Germany, even as they are disavowed, seems to push the conversation in their direction, even by more mainstream policies, right? So the more attention we give to disavowing these, the more space we actually have on the right. When we push them as radical, and Murray does this all the time, I'm not saying I support Pegida, I'm not saying I support Tommy Robinson, but they raise really good points. This is one of his rhetorical moves. And what it does is create this sort of intellectual space, I think, that captures a lot of people's anxieties. Let me add 2 more points about Murray's book, one more critical and one more surprising. First, I actually agree with Murray's title, that the future of Europe is at stake at the moment, but not in the way that he suggests. What is at stake in the future of European commitments? What is at stake is the future of European in general, and British and American more specifically, commitments to the rule of law, human rights, and human equality, as this is manifested, as we've heard in the first 2 talks, in a commitment to the fair adjudication of asylum cases. As Georgia Agamben has powerfully written, refugees functions as icons for those who are excluded from the world and excluded from politics and come to be a symbol for what we take as important and valuable. In fact, while his entire book seems to be a screed against Merkel, it is in fact Merkel, as much as I may disagree with other parts of her politics, is Merkel who has not made a radical break with the European tradition, as she continually emphasizes. Merkel is actually the more truly conservative and traditional politician on the field in Europe today, at least judged by post-war settlements, calling Europe to maintain its standards and its rules, even in the face of significant strain, right? So I think there's this, one of the dominant narratives is that Merkel changed the rules of the game. I don't think this is true. I think Merkel saw that everyone else was changing the rules of the game and said, we're not going to. Now, this isn't a full embrace of it. She did change where you get adjudicated, but I think that's important to note. Second, and this is to the point of this conference, when you take a closer look at this book, a surprising disruption occurs in his dominant narrative of decline. In the middle chapters, Murray goes to Lampedusa in Italy and Lesbos in Greece, where he seeks to find ways to reinforce his narrative. But he oddly finds it troubled. On the one hand, he seems to detect a sinister plot amongst activists and news media that paint a much smoother story than the one of open welcome that he thought was dominant in the autumn of 2015. The other, though, is that his narrative begins to crack and his sympathy open up through his encounter with a group of Afghan men and boys who narrate their own experience of violence. He asked them why they didn't simply stay in Pakistan, considering it was a neighboring move. They respond that they're from a small Shia community and that they would have no political possibility there. They describe how the wars and ongoing wars, both of the United States and the United Kingdom, have caused disruption, how there's actually more work to be had in Afghanistan than there is in Italy. As they respond to his questions, you see his excuses began to fade. But he moves on so quickly, as if these are just narratives that he can brush aside, but he can't leave behind. There was some fissure, some interruption. But as a writer with a polemical agenda, he needs to continue on. And I think here we see something of both the possibilities of encounter and narration, as well as its limits. And that's something I want us to get to grips with. Encounter with other human beings begins to transform even Douglas Murray But before that transformation can truly take place and move into the arena of political and legal action, he finds a way to foreclose it into a one-on-one encounter, marked by an individual case. And I think this is actually the more challenging question we need to ask ourselves. And it's one that I've seen, I shouldn't say this on video, in my own family, and a number of people who have these individual encounters with refugees, people seeking refugee status, asylum seekers, who will go an extra mile to provide hospitality and hope and job training and friendship and meals, will find themselves individually transformed. And yet, when it comes to policy engagement, vote for and support the very thing that either constricts or proves death dealing. The two questions I want us to consider I've totally gone over, in the last 5 minutes that I maybe have, we'll skip ahead, is how can the narratives that we seek to listen to and tell today, one, challenge the dominant narrative of our political arena today, and two, how can we allow these narratives, these encounters, to actually be so transformative that they don't remain on the interpersonal level alone? Is that clear? I'm going to skip the thing about David Miller. It's actually a really interesting book that tries to provide a conservative, communitarian account of restricted immigration policies. He teaches at Oxford. I disagree with him, but it's worth looking at because it's often thought about, even called as much by Rowan Williams in The New Statesman, adult account of why we reject immigrants. So just look at that. Let me skip ahead to my conclusion. I always misjudge these. One of the chief challenges facing us, I think, is that even when we encounter the narratives of human beings seeking asylum, be those through everyday human contact, longer-term friendship, shared worship, celebrations, the stories we've heard this morning, or even just in news pictures or novels or films, is how quickly they find themselves relocated within the pre-existing narratives around immigration and national belonging. The state, and I don't mean this intentionally, and the dominant narrative has a way of claiming these counter-narratives and relocating them within themselves as exceptions, as stories of the good, welcoming country that accepted these, right? They don't allow them to disrupt the narrative. That is to say that often the narratives of human beings seeking asylum or refugee status have their legitimacy given only insofar as they stay within the dominant narrative. But to be recognized as such, right? To be recognized by the dominant narratives, the human narratives have to be written in such a way to fit in with pre-existing expectations, hopes, and aims of any society or state, to prove that I can be productive, to prove that I'm not that kind of Muslim, to prove that I've had this kind of trauma, to prove that I'm truly a Christian now. I'll get to that in a second. While part of this is benign, a simple case of translation into the idiom of law or culture or language of any society, something that happens every day in an exchange, there are also more insidious features that serve to minimize the full dignity and humanity of people seeking political community, as if worth is only given by law and society. It also, I think, tempts those of us who reside within those existing structures, those of us that possess either powerful passports or powerful visas, to restrict our own commitments and moral arguments we make to those that will keep us on the right side of this political narrative. This is seen, of course, most clearly in the actual adjudication and appeals process of those seeking political asylum in the United Kingdom. As you know, in these cases, I won't get into this, we've talked about this. My own first encounter with the asylum process in the United Kingdom came a few months after my arrival here from the United States. I was asked by a lawyer in Edinburgh to serve as an expert witness in the case of a man from Pakistan. Let's call him Ahmed. Ahmed had converted from Shia Islam to join the Roman Catholic Church. However, his asylum case was denied because while he could, quote, answer basic questions about Christianity, he had difficulty answering more complex questions about the Christian tradition, papal power, and the Second Vatican Council. I kid you not. Of course, Ahmed spoke Urdu fluently and attended a church underground that had a Urdu-speaking Bible study. And yet the questions were asked by someone speaking English who often functioned under the assumption that to be Christian in the United Kingdom is to be a member of the Church of England, or to a lesser extent, maybe the Church of Scotland and maybe the Catholic Church, right? So he could answer basic questions about the nature of the four Gospels, about the book of Revelation, about the sacraments, but he struggled at answering questions about polity. This is actually not odd. Sometimes questions are even simply asked of what color is the Bible in these cases, right? But what the state was doing is determining for itself what defines membership in the Catholic Church. Membership was not confirmed through baptism or confirmation or welcome, but by the state's ability to recognize someone. The state had taken to itself the power to determine what counts as Christianity or not. This case is even more problematic in numerous people who convert to some form of Pentecostal or evangelical Christianity who find their own models of Christianity not welcomed or recognized in these models. But what you see happening in this situation is the state and the law taking unto itself the power to bind and to loose. I mean that quite intentionally. This is echoing partly Carl Schmitt. To bind and loose individuals, and even to bind and loose the imagination of the church, of what it means to be and to belong. Insofar as liberal or progressive responses to critiques around national identity, economic activity, and security serve to challenge incorrect assumptions that drive fear and reinforce narratives of worth and unworth, they're worth engaging. Still, I worry that this is not enough, and it's not proving sufficient, both in the general public and among certain religious communities, particularly, I think, Christianity, who finds its own rhetoric so clearly tied with European identity. Let me end with this. The radical transformation that we need of the migration process will not come through statistics, political white papers, or church statements alone. What is needed and what is demanded is a fundamental shift in the way that immigration and asylum is narrated. Part of this entails shifting the primary character in the stories we tell. Here, in our legal advocacy, in our churches and our mosques, in our synagogues and our temples, in our secular societies. From those that begin with the host or receiving nation, to the narrative and testimonies of human beings who reside betwixt and between the migration system. One key element in doing this, I think, is to rethink how we approach law and state, particularly as both claim to bind and loose and confer dignity and worth. The Christian tradition in general, and my own Protestant tradition more specifically, influenced as it is by Lutheran and Swiss reformers. I'm aware I'm saying this in a Jesuit building. Let's remember the Joint Declaration on Justification. Has long contended, and this goes back to Paul, Augustine, and other Catholic thinkers as well, has long contended that human worth and divine favor are not ultimately conferred by law, whether religious or public, but by God's justifying grace. And yet, too often, this most fundamental Christian claim, that our worth, our value, our love comes from God and not the law, has so little political import in how we think about engaging in political action. Karl Barth, one of my favorite theologians, once asked, "How is it that there is no connection between the justification of the sinner through faith, completed once and all through Jesus Christ, and the problem of justice, the problem of human law?" Recent theologians, both Protestant and Catholic, have begun to think about this and to leverage the ways in which this element of the tradition emphasizes that human value resides not in the law but beyond it. And that this has certain influences for how we think about the penal justice system in the United Kingdom, in the case of Duncan Forrester, the rights of African Americans in the United States, in the case of James Cone, but also as it applies to asylum, and I'll close with this. First, theologically speaking, human dignity is not bound to law. Human beings are not refugees, asylum seekers, or citizens. We are simply creatures, loved and claimed as friends, brothers, sisters by Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the law might give, public law might give and should give some imprecise or indirect recognition of this fact, and this is what human rights struggles to. But it cannot ultimately reach it. Second, and finally, following the insights of James Cone, to engage in the powerful narratives of current politics, we need a narrative interruption. The kind of narrative interruption of refugee tales, or of JRS, or of what I saw in Lampedusa, where Catholics, anarchists, Protestants, atheists, and Muslims gathered together to find the names of people who had drowned at sea and to inform their families and perform burials using Skype to bring their families to those places in Eritrea. These kinds of interruptions, these kinds of narratives, ones being told by human beings outside of Glasgow or Gatwick or in a Walmart in South Tequis, are central to what JRS is doing and central to how we need to think about the law. And these narratives echo that other story, that dangerous memory we celebrate around a table of one who was tried and judged guilty by the law, but was vindicated on Sunday morning.